The night of April 1st, 1945, brought no laughter to the men huddled in foxholes across Okinawa's southern ridges. Darkness in the Pacific wasn't simply the absence of light. It was a living, breathing enemy that transformed every rustling leaf into a Japanese infiltrator, every shadow into certain death. American soldiers learned to grip their rifles with sweating hands and pray that dawn would come before the enemy did. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese had spent years perfecting what they called Kishu and Kyoshu, surprise attacks and forced assaults conducted under the protective cloak of darkness. Their doctrine wasn't born from some ancient samurai tradition. It emerged from cold, calculating military logic developed throughout the 1930s when Japanese strategists realized they'd eventually face enemies with superior numbers and equipment. The solution was simple and brutal. Attack when your opponent can't use his advantages. Attack at night. By 1945, this tactical philosophy had been refined into a nightmare for Allied forces across the Pacific. Japanese infiltrators moved through jungle terrain with an almost supernatural silence, sometimes armed with nothing more than grenades and a knife, crawling for miles through hostile territory to reach American positions. They'd slip between foxholes, cut telephone lines, and then vanish back into the darkness before anyone could respond. The psychological effect was devastating. Sleep became impossible. Every sound demanded investigation. Men fired at shadows, at animals, at nothing, burning through ammunition while their nerves frayed to breaking points. The mathematics of night combat favored the Japanese dramatically. An American soldier peering into total darkness might as well have been blind. His rifle, his training, his firepower, all of it meant nothing if he couldn't see the enemy creeping toward his position 15 feet away. The Japanese understood this asymmetry and exploited it ruthlessly. On Guadalcanal in 1942, Marines had strung empty tin cans filled with pebbles along their barbed wire perimeters, primitive noisemakers that would rattle if disturbed. It helped, marginally, but it couldn't stop determined infiltrators who moved with such patience that a 10-yard advance might take an hour. By 1943, American commanders in the Pacific Theater were growing desperate for solutions. The standard infantry weapons, the M1 Garand rifle, the Thompson submachine gun, the Browning automatic rifle, all excellent firearms by daylight, became nearly useless after sunset. You can't shoot what you can't see, and flares or searchlights simply painted bright targets on American positions while revealing little about Japanese movements in the surrounding jungle. Into this tactical crisis stepped an unlikely weapon. The M1 carbine had never been intended as a frontline combat rifle. Designed in 1941, it was meant as a defensive weapon for support troops, officers, vehicle crews, and radio operators. Men whose primary jobs didn't involve direct combat, but who needed something better than a pistol if fighting found them. The carbine fired a .30 caliber round that was significantly less powerful than the Garand's .30-06. It weighed just under 6 pounds, fully loaded, making it light and maneuverable. Most importantly, for what came next, it was small enough and light enough to accommodate experimental equipment that would have turned a full-size rifle into an unwieldy club. The weapon itself generated mixed opinions among combat troops. Some loved its lightweight and handy size, particularly in jungle fighting where every ounce mattered and engagement ranges rarely exceeded 200 yards. Lieutenant Colonel John George, who fought across the Pacific, later wrote that if he had to survive alone in hostile jungle, the carbine would be his weapon of choice. Its lightness allowed for quick movement, and its semi-automatic fire gave leaders and support troops offensive capability they'd never had with pistols. But others complained bitterly. Frontline infantrymen, accustomed to the Garand's hitting power, found the carbine's smaller round inadequate for stopping determined enemy soldiers. There were reports, particularly from Korea later, of Japanese or Chinese troops absorbing multiple carbine hits and continuing to attack. The effective range of around 300 yards was perfectly adequate for jungle fighting, but felt limiting in open terrain. The weapon existed in a strange middle ground, more powerful than a submachine gun, less powerful than a battle rifle, not quite fitting any established role. The Germans, when they captured M1 carbines from American forces or resistance groups in Europe, generally dismissed them. German soldiers and officers felt the weapon was inferior to their bolt-action Carabiner 98K for serious combat. They made little effort to use captured carbines, despite having ample opportunity to acquire them. The weapon simply didn't match their doctrine or their expectations of what a proper combat rifle should accomplish. This widespread skepticism, this sense that the M1 carbine was a compromised weapon for second-line troops, made what happened next all the more remarkable, because by early 1945, American engineers had figured out how to give the humble carbine an ability that no other weapon in any army possessed. They'd found a way to make it see in total darkness. The technology began not with weapons designers but with scientists working on fundamental problems of physics and electronics. Throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s, researchers had been experimenting with infrared light, electromagnetic radiation invisible to the human eye but detectable with specialized equipment. The concept was elegant. An infrared lamp could illuminate a target without producing any visible light. An electronic telescope, sensitive to infrared wavelengths, could then detect the reflected invisible radiation and convert it into a visible image on a cathode ray tube display. By 1943, the United States Army Corps of Engineers had developed working prototypes. They called it the sniper scope, though some soldiers nicknamed the system Millie or Molly. The device consisted of three main components. First, a large infrared spotlight, powered by a backpack battery pack, emitting invisible radiation that flooded the area in front of the operator. Second, an electronic telescope mounted on the weapon that detected infrared reflections from targets and converted them into a glowing green image visible through the scope. Third, the carbine itself, modified with integral mounting brackets brazed onto the receiver to accept the scope assembly. The T3 carbine, as the modified weapon was designated, represented a revolutionary concept. For the first time in military history, a rifleman could aim and fire accurately in complete darkness without revealing his position with visible light. The Japanese infiltrator, creeping through the jungle, invisible to normal human vision, would appear in the infrared scope as a glowing green silhouette against the darker background. The American soldier watching through the scope could track the target, align the reticle, and fire, all while remaining completely hidden in the blackness. Development moved with wartime urgency. The Inland Division of General Motors received the first contract to produce 1,700 T3 carbines in 1944. Winchester followed with additional contracts. The infrared scopes themselves, initially designated T120 and later refined into the M1 and M2 sniper scope models, were manufactured by electronics companies working under Corps of Engineers supervision. By early 1945, the system was ready for combat testing. The equipment was far from perfect. The complete rig weighed approximately 20 pounds on top of the carbine's own weight. The operator had to wear a backpack battery pack connected to both the scope and the infrared spotlight by thick electrical cables. The effective range hovered around 70 to 100 yards, limited by the power of the infrared lamp and the sensitivity of the detection equipment. The image quality in the scope was poor by any standard. A fuzzy green picture on a small cathode ray tube screen that required the operator to squint and concentrate to distinguish targets from background clutter. Battery life was limited. Rain and humidity, constants in Pacific jungle warfare, degraded performance significantly. The infrared lamp had to be positioned carefully to illuminate targets without creating excessive glare in the scope. Operators needed extensive training to interpret the strange glowing images they saw through the eyepiece. The system was classified SECRET, and strict protocols governed its handling, use, and discussion. If a T3 carbine rig was in danger of capture, standing orders required its immediate destruction, even if that meant abandoning the position. Despite these limitations, the potential was staggering. American commanders looking at reports from Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and dozens of other blood-soaked islands saw the same pattern repeating. Japanese night infiltration and harassment attacks inflicted casualties far out of proportion to the numbers of enemy troops involved. The psychological toll was even worse. Men who couldn't sleep, who spent every dark hour in a state of hypervigilant terror, broke down faster than those wounded in daylight combat. Entire units lost combat effectiveness, not from casualties but from accumulated exhaustion and fear. What if that advantage could be reversed? What if American troops could see Japanese infiltrators while remaining invisible themselves? What if the darkness, instead of being Japan's greatest tactical asset, became a killing field, where American technology hunted enemy soldiers like prey? The first shipment of T3 carbines and their infrared scopes left the United States in late 1944, bound for the Philippines and Okinawa. Approximately 200 complete systems reached Pacific theater bases before the war ended. That number sounds insignificant compared to the millions of conventional weapons deployed. But the impact of those 200 systems would prove grossly disproportionate to their quantity. Okinawa was the perfect, terrible testing ground. The battle began on April 1, 1945, when American forces landed on beaches that the Japanese had deliberately left lightly defended. The real fighting waited inland, in the ridges and caves and fortified positions of southern Okinawa. The Japanese 32nd Army, defending the island, numbered over 70,000 troops, supported by 40,000 Okinawan conscripts. Against them, the United States deployed nearly 250,000 soldiers and Marines in what would become one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War. The Japanese defensive strategy relied heavily on night operations. During daylight, American air superiority and naval gunfire made movement suicidal. But after sunset, Japanese troops could infiltrate American lines, position troops for counterattacks, supply forward positions, and evacuate wounded. The nights belonged to them, or so they believed. Soldiers from the 546th Engineer Detachment and other units equipped with T3 carbines took up defensive positions at key points across American lines. They set up in concealed foxholes and bunkers with good fields of fire, battery packs strapped to their backs, carbines resting on sandbags with the strange apparatus of lamp and scope protruding from the weapon. As darkness fell on the first nights of April, they switched on their systems and peered through the scopes at the landscape in front of them. What they saw was revelation. The jungle and ridgeline, pitch black to normal vision, appeared in the scope as a glowing green tableau. Trees, rocks, and terrain features showed as darker masses, and there, moving between them, were bright green human silhouettes, Japanese soldiers, advancing in the darkness with the confidence of men who believed themselves invisible, appeared in the infrared view as clearly as if illuminated by daylight. The T3 operators watched silently as Japanese infiltrators crept closer. Some of the enemy soldiers were crawling, some moving in a low crouch, all convinced that darkness provided complete concealment. The Americans waited, allowing targets to reach optimum range, then opened fire. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and devastating. Japanese soldiers dropped, killed by fire coming from positions they couldn't see, by an enemy they didn't know was there. Survivors scattered in confusion, trying to locate the source of the shooting, but the Americans gave them nothing to aim at. No muzzle flashes visible to normal eyes, no visible light to mark the shooter's position, just sudden death arriving from the darkness. The psychological impact was catastrophic for the Japanese forces. Their night infiltration tactics, honed through years of training and combat experience, suddenly became suicide missions. Men who'd successfully used darkness as camouflage throughout the war now died in that same darkness, killed by an enemy who could apparently see through solid black night. Japanese troops began reporting to their officers that the Americans possessed some kind of supernatural ability or advanced technology that allowed them to fight at night. Some refused to conduct night operations, a remarkable breakdown of discipline in an army known for following orders regardless of cost. Over the first week of the Okinawa campaign, an astonishing pattern emerged in casualty statistics. Approximately 30% of all Japanese soldiers killed by small arms fire during that period fell victim to the infrared-equipped T3 carbines. This is a staggering figure, when you consider that only 200 of these systems existed among the hundreds of thousands of conventional weapons deployed by American forces. A tiny fraction of total firepower was accounting for nearly a third of enemy casualties in its category. The effectiveness went beyond simple kill counts. Japanese night operations across the entire front became hesitant and disorganized. Even units that never directly encountered T-3-equipped positions grew cautious, having heard reports from survivors or observed the mysterious deaths of comrades in sectors where darkness should have provided safety. The Americans had seized the initiative in the one phase of combat, where Japan had held clear superiority since the war began. Operators of the T-3 system described the experience in terms that mixed awe with the grim reality of their task. One report noted it was surreal to sit in a concealed position and watch green images of enemy soldiers creep forward through what appeared to your naked eye as impenetrable blackness. The scope operator would track the target, confirm it was enemy through movement patterns and approach direction, then calmly align the reticle and fire. A brief burst from the carbine, and the green silhouette would crumple and disappear. Then the operator would scan for the next target, while Japanese troops tried desperately to understand where death was coming from. The equipment remained temperamental. Rain could reduce the system's effectiveness dramatically, as water droplets scattered the infrared illumination and created false returns in the scope. The limited battery life meant operators had to conserve power, switching the system off during quiet periods and activating it only when expecting enemy movement. The dim image quality required intense concentration, causing eye strain during long observation periods. But despite these drawbacks, the T-3 carbine with its infrared scope was accomplishing what no other weapon system could. It was denying the enemy his sanctuary in darkness. The technology behind the infrared scope was remarkably sophisticated for 1945, yet it relied on principles that scientists had understood for decades. Infrared radiation sits just beyond the visible spectrum of light, with wavelengths slightly longer than what human eyes can detect. Every object emits some level of infrared radiation based on its temperature, but the T-3 system didn't rely on passive detection of heat signatures like modern thermal imaging. Instead, it used active illumination. The infrared spotlight mounted beneath the carbine's stock contained a standard 6-volt, 30-watt sealed beam lamp covered by a special filter. This filter, made from Corning glass overlaid with dyed cellophane, blocked all visible light while allowing infrared wavelengths to pass through. When powered on, the lamp flooded the area ahead with invisible radiation. To anyone looking toward the operator with normal vision, nothing appeared. No light, no glow, nothing to reveal the shooter's position. But through the electronic telescope, the scene transformed. The infrared radiation reflected off objects and returned to the scope's detector, where an image converter tube performed the crucial translation. This tube, about the size of a large flashlight, contained a photocathode that released electrons when struck by infrared photons. These electrons were accelerated and focused onto a phosphor screen, which glowed green wherever electrons hit it. The result was a visible image derived from invisible light, displayed on a cathode ray tube screen small enough to fit in a rifle scope. The Inland Division of General Motors and Winchester produced the modified T-3 carbines with receivers specially machined to accept scope mounting brackets. These weren't standard M1 carbines retrofitted with attachments. They were purpose-built weapons with integral mounting systems brazed directly onto the receiver. The stock had been modified as well, cut and shaped to accommodate the large infrared lamp assembly. Everything about the T-3 design served a single purpose: mounting and operating the infrared scope system as effectively as possible. Production totaled approximately 1,900 T-3 carbines by war's end, split between Inland's 811 units and Winchester's 1,108. The infrared scopes themselves numbered around 1,700 during wartime production. Given the secret classification and the specialized nature of the equipment, very few of these systems survived the war intact. Most were destroyed deliberately when their secret status was declassified, and they were removed from service, cut apart with torches to prevent any possibility of the technology falling into enemy hands during the tense early Cold War years. The scopes that did reach Okinawa arrived with strict operational procedures. Commanders assigned them to intelligence and reconnaissance platoons, to units holding critical defensive positions, and to soldiers who demonstrated the patience and discipline required for the role. Operating a T3 system wasn't like firing a conventional rifle. It required sitting motionless for hours, watching the green display, conserving battery power, and resisting the temptation to fire at every shadow or false return. The best operators developed techniques for distinguishing genuine targets from background clutter. Japanese soldiers moved with characteristic patterns, low crouches or crawls, following terrain features and natural concealment. Animals moved differently, more erratic and less purposeful. Rain created a confusing spray of returns that obscured everything. But a skilled operator could pick out the human-shaped silhouette, track it patiently as it approached, and deliver fire at the moment of maximum effectiveness. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Some T3 operators used tracer ammunition, not just to mark their own targets, but to direct other weapons onto enemy concentrations. When the infrared scope revealed a large group of Japanese troops moving through the darkness, the operator might fire a burst of tracers to illuminate the position for nearby machine gunners. The machine guns would then open fire, raking the area with devastating effect while the enemy struggled to understand how they'd been detected and marked. This combination of individual sniping and direction of supporting fires multiplied the T3's effectiveness beyond what the weapon itself could achieve. A single operator with an infrared scope became a force multiplier, turning conventional machine guns and riflemen into precision instruments of night combat instead of blind men firing at sounds and guesses. The Japanese had no countermeasure. They'd developed their own infrared technology in limited quantities, the Vampire system mounted on assault rifles, but these never deployed to the Pacific in any meaningful numbers. Most remained in Europe, used on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces. Even if Japanese troops had possessed infrared detection equipment, they lacked the industrial capacity and technical expertise to produce it in quantities that mattered. The Americans held the technological advantage, and in night combat, that advantage proved decisive. As the Okinawa campaign ground through April and into May of 1945, the pattern established in those first weeks continued. American forces advanced slowly through murderous terrain, taking casualties from well-prepared Japanese defensive positions during daylight. But at night, the advantage shifted. Japanese attempts to infiltrate, to stage surprise attacks, to resupply forward positions, all became vastly more dangerous and less effective. The T3-equipped positions acted as watchful eyes in the darkness, seeing what conventional troops couldn't, killing with precision where others fired blind. The broader strategic situation was accelerating toward conclusion. American forces were tightening the noose around Japan itself. The firebombing of Tokyo in March had killed over 100,000 civilians. More incendiary raids hammered other Japanese cities throughout the spring. The naval blockade strangled Japanese industry of raw materials and fuel. But none of that changed the immediate tactical reality on Okinawa, where men still had to take each ridge, each cave, each fortified position through close combat that killed Americans and Japanese in horrific numbers. The battle officially ended on June 21, 1945, after 82 days of fighting that claimed over 12,000 American lives and wounded more than 38,000. Japanese casualties exceeded 100,000 military personnel killed, along with between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians caught in the maelstrom. The scale of destruction shocked both sides and significantly influenced American planning for the invasion of Japan's home islands. The T3 Carbines' role in the campaign remained classified long after the war ended. Soldiers who'd operated the systems were instructed not to discuss them. The equipment itself was collected and either destroyed or placed in secure storage. The strategic reasoning was simple. The Korean peninsula was already showing signs of the conflict that would erupt in 1950, and American planners wanted to preserve any technological advantages for future combat. If potential enemies didn't know about the infrared scope systems, they couldn't develop countermeasures or their own competing technologies. When war did come to Korea in June 1950, the infrared systems returned to combat. By then, the technology had been refined. The M3 carbine, an M2 selective fire carbine fitted with an improved M3 infrared scope, offered better range, approximately 125 yards effective, and relocated the infrared lamp to the top of the scope instead of beneath the stock. This allowed operators to fire from the prone position more effectively. The battery pack remained cumbersome, but was slightly more reliable than the World War II version. Approximately 20,000 M3 scope sets were produced between 1950 and 1951, a massive increase over the few hundred systems available in 1945. These saw extensive use during the Korean War's static phases, when front lines stabilized and both sides settled into defensive positions, reminiscent of World War I trench warfare. The M3 systems were particularly effective against Chinese and North Korean infiltration attempts, once again denying the enemy his advantage in darkness. But soldiers in Korea viewed the equipment with mixed feelings. It was effective when it worked, but the weight, the limited battery life, the maintenance requirements, and the overall fragility of the systems generated complaints. Many troops preferred conventional weapons that functioned reliably in all conditions, rather than a technological marvel that might fail at a critical moment. The tactical advantage was undeniable, but the practical hassles created skepticism among combat infantrymen who had to carry and maintain the equipment under field conditions. The technology evolved rapidly through the 1950s and 60s. The ANPAS-4 system developed for the M14 rifle offered improved performance and reliability, but still used active infrared illumination. The true revolution came with passive night vision, the starlight scopes that amplified ambient light rather than requiring an infrared spotlight. These passive systems eliminated the fundamental vulnerability of active infrared, the fact that anyone else with an infrared scope could see your illuminator lamp like a beacon in the darkness. Vietnam War-era starlight scopes, and eventually the modern night vision goggles used by military forces worldwide, all trace their lineage back to those crude T3 carbines fielded on Okinawa in 1945. The concept of electronic vision enhancement, of using technology to see what human eyes cannot, began with those bulky backpack batteries and fuzzy green images. Every iteration improved the technology, made it lighter and more capable, until night vision became a standard tool rather than an exotic experiment. The historical irony is striking. The Germans, who'd dismissed the M1 carbine as an inadequate weapon unworthy of serious military consideration, never realized what American engineers had done with that humble platform. German troops mocked the carbine when they encountered it in Europe, viewing it as evidence of American industrial wastefulness, producing millions of mediocre weapons instead of focusing on quality designs like the Carbine 98K or the revolutionary Sturmgewehr 44. What they missed was the American approach to warfare. The United States didn't just produce weapons, it produced systems, combining adequate firearms with technological enhancements that transformed their capabilities beyond what pure mechanical design could achieve. The M1 carbine wasn't designed to be the most powerful or accurate rifle. It was designed to be light, handy, and adaptable. That adaptability allowed engineers to mount experimental equipment that would have been impossible on a full-size battle rifle. The Japanese, who'd spent years perfecting night infiltration tactics, found their tactical doctrine rendered obsolete by a technology they didn't know existed until it was killing them. Their training manuals, their combat experience, their institutional knowledge about night operations, all of it became dangerously outdated on Okinawa. The darkness that had been their sanctuary became a trap, illuminated by invisible light that revealed them while concealing their enemies. The story of the T3 carbine illustrates how technological innovation can overturn established tactical advantages with shocking speed. The Japanese military had developed night combat capabilities over more than a decade of warfare in China and the Pacific. They'd refined techniques, trained soldiers extensively, and built an entire tactical philosophy around exploiting darkness. American forces, in contrast, had traditionally preferred daylight operations where superior firepower and air support could be fully utilized. But in less than 2 years from conception to combat deployment, American engineers and scientists created a system that reversed that advantage completely. The T-3, with its infrared scope, wasn't a wonder weapon that won the war. The broader strategic situation, America's industrial might, the naval blockade, the firebombing campaign, and the eventual atomic bombs, those factors determined Japan's defeat. But on the tactical level, in the fighting that soldiers experienced directly, the infrared scope changed everything about night combat. The soldiers who operated T-3 systems on Okinawa witnessed something unprecedented. They watched enemy troops move through darkness, visible only through the glowing green screen of their scopes. They fired at targets that appeared clearly in their sights, but remained invisible to anyone else. They survived nights that would have been terrifying uncertainties with conventional weapons, transformed into calculated hunting, because they could see while remaining unseen. One account from an operator described the surreal quality of the experience. Watching the green silhouettes creep forward while hearing the jungle, sounds of a Pacific night created a disconnect between sight and other senses. The scope showed the enemy clearly, but your ears heard nothing unusual. Your eyes, looking away from the scope at the actual jungle, saw only blackness. The combat became abstract, almost like watching a film, until you pulled the trigger and the recoil reminded you this was real, that the green silhouette you'd just shot was a human being who'd fallen dead in darkness he thought protected him. The moral and psychological dimensions of this technology troubled some observers even then. There's something particularly unsettling about killing an enemy who has no chance to defend himself, who doesn't even know you're there until the bullets hit. Traditional combat, however brutal, involves mutual awareness. Both sides see each other, shoot at each other, take cover, and maneuver with some understanding of where danger lies. The infrared scope broke that symmetry completely. Japanese soldiers died without warning, killed by an invisible enemy using an unknown technology. They couldn't adapt their tactics because they didn't understand what they faced. Some units reported Americans could see in darkness, like cats. Others believed captured Japanese troops were being used as guides, pointing out infiltrators to American shooters. The truth, that electronic scopes were detecting infrared reflections, lay beyond their technical knowledge or experience. They couldn't counter what they couldn't comprehend. This pattern would repeat throughout military history. Advanced technology deployed against enemies unfamiliar with it creates not just tactical advantages, but psychological devastation. The confusion, the inability to understand what's happening, the sense that you're fighting an enemy with supernatural powers, all of this erodes morale and combat effectiveness as thoroughly as casualties do. The T-3 carbine inflicted both types of damage on Japanese forces at Okinawa. The weapon's legacy extends beyond its direct combat use. It established the principle that night vision technology could be miniaturized and deployed at the infantry level. Before the T-3, night vision systems existed primarily as large, stationary installations or naval equipment. The idea that an individual soldier could carry and operate a night vision system in combat was unproven. The success on Okinawa validated the concept and drove decades of subsequent development. Modern military forces treat night operations as routine, even preferable in many situations. Night vision goggles, thermal imaging, laser designators, and other technologies allow contemporary soldiers to operate in darkness with greater effectiveness than their grandfathers had in daylight. That transformation began with the crude, heavy, temperamental T-3 system and its fuzzy green images of enemy soldiers who never saw their deaths approaching. The M1 carbine itself went on to a long service life despite its critics. Over 6 million were produced during World War II, more than any other American infantry weapon. After the war, it saw action in Korea, Vietnam, and dozens of smaller conflicts worldwide. Allied nations received hundreds of thousands as military aid. Some are still in use today in various parts of the world, a testament to the basic soundness of the design, even if it never achieved the legendary status of the M1 Garand or the M1911 pistol. But for that brief moment on Okinawa in 1945, the humble carbine that German soldiers had mocked became something extraordinary. It became the first practical night vision weapon system in military history, the grandfather of every night vision device that followed. The 200 T3 systems deployed to the Pacific Theater accounted for 30% of Japanese casualties from small arms fire in the opening week of the campaign. That figure alone tells the story of how completely the technology changed the tactical equation. The soldiers who fell victim to those infrared-guided shots died without ever knowing what killed them. They'd trained for night infiltration, practiced the techniques, executed the approaches correctly according to their doctrine. Everything they did was tactically sound based on the warfare they understood. But warfare had changed, in ways they couldn't see until it was too late. The darkness that should have protected them became illuminated by invisible light, and the Americans they thought were blind in the night saw them clearly enough to kill. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.